Hi everyone, it's Paul Tilley and welcome back to EC1210 Macroeconomics. Today we're looking at Unit 9, International Trade. Now international trade is covered in Unit 9, as I say, and you will find the readings for this in Chapter 10 of the textbook. Really, we're looking at four key things in this unit. We're going to explain the importance of international trade and why nations trade with each other. We're going to explain why nations import certain goods, even though they can be made more cheaply at home. And we're going to explain how gains from trade are divided between trading partners, and we're going to identify various restrictions to and some arguments against free trade. Looking at the first one, looking at the importance of international trade. Trade's important. Canada particularly, trade is super important. Why is that? Well, the reality is we're 38 million people. That's not a very big market. If we look at the United States down below, there's 380 million people. It's 10 times the size of the market. In order to be able to produce all the goods and services that we produce, for 38 million people, it would be hard to get the economies of scale that we require. So if we can produce certain things, such as minerals, such as oil, and sell them abroad to other countries who can't do those necessary things, there are certain benefits to that, and we can get a larger market, which means that overall fixed costs are broken amongst a larger number of quantity items, and as a result, it'll keep prices down. And if we think of Newfoundland and Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador was really sold because of trade. The abundance of cod out off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador really was key to this place being sold, but there was no internal market for it. Newfoundland really had no people worthwhile, so what we had to do was to sell the product or bring the product to places like Jamaica, where it was often traded for things like rum. So it seems obvious that there are great benefits from trade, but there's always been some underlying suspicion of whether it's useful or not, whether we should, made in China, for example. So in this particular unit, we're looking at trade from an economics perspective in order to give you a good understanding of why it happens and what the economic and social reasons for it happening are. So if we look at the rationale for trade, the rationale for trade really came from Adam Smith, and Adam Smith was really the founder of modern day capitalism. Whenever two people voluntarily agree to trade, they're better off at the end than if they just kept them themselves. So that's really what the premise of his basic argument was. So in essence, the main argument for trade is, why make something yourself if someone else can do it more cheaply? So if it takes you 3 hours to make a certain product, but you can buy it elsewhere from income that you can make in 1 hour, wouldn't it be more efficient for you to just focus on your job and go buy that item for 1 hour's worth of work? So let's look at trade in the world. Since 83, and 83 in my mind wasn't that long ago, world trade in 1983 was about $1,800 billion. If we look at 2018, and those numbers are getting dated now, that had increased tenfold to more than $19,000 billion. And for most countries, really, trade as a percentage of their gross domestic product has also risen appreciably. So we've seen a lot more trade. So if we look at this graphic here that shows the growth of trade, this is 2018 numbers, but you can see that China and US are very much on top, and China has really grown in the last number of years. The US, Germany, Japan, Netherlands, South Korea are also big trading nations. But relative to the size of Canada, those are small nations, so they do a lot of trade. Canada comes in 12th, but you can see that each of those countries is well off, and the benefits of trade is really demonstrated on their material wealth as a country. So there's really a number of reasons behind the growth of international trade. First of all, technology has really come into play, and on two fronts. First of all, on the physical movement front, large container ships, container ports, they have made trade so much easier. These ships are huge, carrying thousands and thousands of containers, bringing products from all over the world to all over the world. But the non-tangible things are flowing over the internet. Services, information have become key in our society today. The internet has facilitated the flow of those services and information in a speed of light speed, and they certainly have increased the amount of trade. We've also seen a huge reduction in trade barriers amongst countries. There's been movement towards freer trade by countries linking up, creating trade unions, the European Union being one of them, the North American Free Trade Agreement being one of them, the Asia-Pacific Agreement being another. There's lots of these examples where countries have said, there's a lot of benefit to trade and we should facilitate it. Let's reduce the barriers and the impediments to trade, and that's exactly what's happened. And thirdly, to follow the Soviet Union has really sent a signal out there to say, let's get more people working together, more countries working together. So trade liberalization policies have really flowed and opened up countries like China. Low-cost labor has certainly helped, but certainly even places like the Soviet Union have increased sales, even despite the fact that there's a war on the go right now with Ukraine. We look at it here in North America, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which started out as the Free Trade Agreement back in the late 80s, has really facilitated a huge growth of trade. Multi-billion dollars a day flow across the Canadian-US borders. In fact, the two countries have a very much integrated system for a lot of the production, for example, automobiles. So two-way trade, you can see, has increased significantly over the years, and you can see that the actual products in terms of agriculture, energy, autos, manufacturing, services, and the non-energy commodities have really grown a lot. So let's now turn our attention to what are some of the theoretical issues that we need to look at in order to understand trade. The first thing we need to understand is this concept of factor endowment. Now, when we went and looked at our very first economics course, microeconomics, we talked about this issue of the factors of production. And really, the factor endowment that we have is made up of our factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Certain countries have huge amounts of land, huge amounts of labor, huge amounts of capital. Others have varying degrees of those, And if you have, for example, lots of labor, very little capital, or if you have lots of land, very little capital, these sorts of things, trade allows countries to take advantage of those particular assets that you have. These assets are called factor endowments. So one person has an advantage in production over others if he or she is endowed with certain natural or acquired skills, or have more better equipment or other resources. So a country will have a great advantage in producing and trading pineapples, for instance, if it possesses the right type of soil and the right type of climate. But the same country may not have any real advantage in growing coniferous trees. So another country may have advantages in growing coniferous trees or producing electronic equipment or any number of things. So if countries who have certain advantages in key assets, their factor endowment, can trade them with other countries that have different factor endowments, we can all mutually benefit. So a factor endowment in economics is commonly understood to be any amount of land, labor, capital, or entrepreneurship that a country possesses. And differences in factor endowments between the nations and the theory of absolute advantage explain why, for example, Canada exports lumber and imports bananas. So we're going to talk about the concept of absolute and comparative advantage in a few minutes. Differences in trade patterns are a result of differences in climate, differences in natural resources, differences in human capital, and differences in government policy. Let's now turn our attention to explaining why nations import certain goods, even though they can be made more cheaply at home. As I say, Adam Smith really came up with this theory of absolute advantage. And really what it says is a country will gravitate to producing in those areas where, because of its factor endowments, it possesses a cost advantage over other producing countries. So, for example, Canada produces a lot of wheat, lumber, and minerals because we have a lot of them. Chile produces copper and other metals because it has lots of them. Australia exports mineral fuels such as oil and gas. China produces electronic equipment, machines, and so on. So we can think of every country has these factor endowments that they do better than anyone else. Adam Smith proposed that nations, like firms and individuals, should specialize in what they do well. They have a natural advantage in it. If we look at an example of the theory of absolute advantage with numbers. Let's take a look. So what we have here in this table is a per worker production, okay? So let's assume that Canada has workers on a given day or a given year or whatever. Canada can produce 3 wheat with its workers. Alternatively, it could focus on beans, and it could produce 2 beans per worker. Mexico, on the other hand, they'd only get 1 wheat out of their workers, or they'd get 4 beans out of their workers. So really the workers are making one or the other, and how much could you produce in a given day is really what we're looking at. So looking at this just kind of at a top tree level point of view, Canada seems to have a much better advantage in terms of producing wheat. That worker could produce a lot more wheat than the Mexican worker. And Mexican workers have a bigger advantage growing beans than Canadian workers. Okay? So effectively we say Canada is more productive producing wheat than Mexico, whereas Mexico is more productive producing beans than Canada. So let's assume then that there's no trade going on. No trade allowed. We're not allowed to trade. So Canada has 16 million population. Let's assume they're all workers. So 16 million people go at something. If we need both of those products, let's assume that we're going to put 8 million people to work making wheat and 8 million people to work making beans, okay? So this is that little chart there shows the output per worker. So there's 3 wheat per worker, and we got 8 million people, remember, working at the wheat, so that's 24 million wheat. We got 8 million people working at the beans, so 2 beans times 8 is 16 million beans. Mexico says, okay, let's do the same thing. We got about 6 million people too. We're going to put 8 million of them work making wheat. They produce 1, so 1 times 8 million is 8 million. So, and in beans, they get 4 beans per worker, so 8 million workers times 4 is 32 million. So you can see that, again, Canada is not making as many beans and Mexico is not making as much wheat. But if we add them together, like we think about the total production of Canada, Mexico combined, with no trade, there's 32 million wheat being produced and 48 million beans being produced. Okay, so each country produces for its own market in this particular scenario. And you think, okay, well, we got lots. Yeah, that's good. But can we be more efficient? So what Adam Smith said, look, let's stick to do what you do best. So let's look at this scenario where we assume that we do what we do best. Again, same situation where we got each Canadian worker can produce 3 wheat and each Canadian worker can produce 2 beans, or each Mexican worker can produce 1 wheat, or each Mexican worker can produce 4 beans. So in this case, we're going to trade. So what we're going to do is focus on what we do best. So let's assume that Canada says, okay, look, we're very good at making wheat. We're just going to take all our workforce and produce wheat. We're just going to focus on wheat. And Mexico says, look, we're going to take all our workforce and we're going to focus it on beans. And what we'll do is we'll trade. We'll mutually trade, okay? So in this particular case, then, Canada takes its 16 million workers and it produces 3 wheat per worker, which is a total of 48 million wheat. So Mexico takes all its workers and says, we produce beans so much better, so let's just focus on beans. So it takes 16 million workers and they produce 4 beans each. That's 64 million. Now, Mexico doesn't do wheat and Canada doesn't do beans because, again, we're going to trade and all our workers are focusing on what we do best. Let's add up what the totals are now. So total wheat production is 48 million. And the total beans production is 64 million. Now let's compare that to without trade. Without trade, we only made a total 32 million. So with trade, we're making 48 million. Much more productive, isn't it? And beans, look at beans. Without trade, there were 48 million beans made. With trade, now there's 64 million. So it demonstrates that with trade, not only can we trade our products, but we can produce absolutely more product because we're much better at it. So this is the theory of absolute advantage that says, let's focus on what we do well to produce overall, in total, for the world perspective, more product. And this has really been the driver of why trade has expanded. If we can get the technical issues of trade, shipping it and moving it, taken care of, then it makes a lot more sense and be much more productive to trade. So specialization and trade go hand in hand. Specialization leads to increased total production, as we've seen. If a country is going to specialize, it will need to trade in order to obtain the products it's not producing itself. So we saw that. There's no more televisions, for example, made in North America. They're all made over in the Far East because it's cheaper to make them over there. And specialization then implies trade, and it would be impossible to have one without the other. So that was the theory of absolute advantage. The theory of absolute advantage, it holds a lot of weight. But in addition, we've got another theory that has come or been built on top of that. So economist David Ricardo followed in the footsteps of Adam Smith, agreed in principle with Smith, but he added a subtle but important refinement to Smith's theory. Effectively, he came up with the theory of comparative advantage, where he argued that producing something at a lower opportunity cost than others is advantageous. And if we can do that, we should trade. So if we look at the theory of comparative advantage right here, we could think about output per worker by country and industry. So if we think in the United States and Philippines, for example, the United States could produce 4 wheat or 4 beans. So they're equally good at making both. The Philippines, on the other hand, could produce 1 wheat or 3 beans. So, you think about you put your workers put your workers focused on one or the other. It seems like it's indifferent in the United States whether they produce beans or wheat, but Philippines, certainly, they seem to have a much more advantageous setup with beans. So if each country has a trade-off or opportunity cost for the items produced. So, if you think about it, the United States is either going to produce 1 bean or 1 wheat. That would be the trade-off, the cost of producing 1 unit. And the Philippines, they'll give up 3 beans in order to produce the wheat, or 1/3 of a wheat in order to produce the bean. So the U.S. is comparatively better at making wheat. We think about it, it gives up 1 bean while the Philippines give up 3. So the opportunity cost of production then for the United States is 1 bean or 1 wheat. Or the Philippines is 3 beans or 1/3 wheat. So the Philippines is comparatively better at beans than the United States. So it gives up 1/3 of a wheat while the U.S. gives up a whole wheat in order to produce 1 bean. So both could be better off by specializing with trade. So Ricardo's real addition was this issue of opportunity cost and looking at what do you give up when you make 1 more unit of the other. We can see, suppose the United States produces C while the Philippines produces at B, with assuming no trade, okay? So let's assume that the United States here is producing 240 wheat and 160 beans, and the Philippines producing 80 wheat and 60 beans. So if we think about how much they produce in total, 240 from the U.S. in terms of wheat plus 80 from the Philippines in terms of wheat is 320 wheat. And in terms of beans, 160 are being produced in the U.S., 60 are being produced in the Philippines for a total of 220 beans. Now, suppose the United States specializes in A while the Philippines specializes in F, and they trade. So in this case, what the United States is doing is focusing totally on wheat. So it's producing 400 wheat and no beans. And let's assume that the Philippines is producing totally beans because it's producing no wheat and 300 beans. In this case, if we look at the total amount of product being produced, 400 wheat for the United States, 300 beans for Philippines, and if we look at it, that's 80 more wheat and 80 more beans in total. So there's a lot more being produced. This concept, comparative advantage, really demonstrates that trading, even though you say that, I can do both things equally well, by looking at comparative advantage and the opportunity cost of producing that, we can determine what we should and shouldn't produce, and what we should trade and what we shouldn't trade. Now let's look at learning objective 3, where we explain the gains from trade and how to divide it between trading partners. First of all, we talk about this concept of the terms of trade. And really, the expression terms of trade refers to the price that each country sells its exports compared with the price that it buys its imports. So we're just looking at a comparative of the two. And Stats Canada regularly measures Canada's terms of trade using the following formula. So the terms of trade is really the average price of exports divided by the average price of imports. Nothing more complicated than that. So the benefits of trade then is really lower prices because lower cost of production, higher productivity, and it results in higher incomes. So if we look at the benefits of trades, well, ultimately it means lower prices. Those prices are lower because of the lower cost of production, higher incomes that result from that, and also the real focus on productivity. It also gives us a greater variety. You think about the fact that you can buy strawberries in Newfoundland in the middle of winter. And it gives us higher quality products. The quality of a strawberry grown somewhere where it's warm is much greater than a product where it's not so warm. And it certainly increases competition. Competition effectively drives down prices. So you ask the question, well, if trade is so wonderful, people are still against it. What are some of the tools to use in order to effectively reduce trade? Well, those tools are known as protectionist tools. And they include things like import quotas, tariffs, currency exchange controls, regulations, and voluntary export restrictions. When we look at protectionism, protectionism is really the economic policy of protecting domestic producers by restricting the import. Again, keeping strawberry farmers in Newfoundland happy by reducing the number of imports that come in from outside. One of the ways we can do that is through a quota. A quota limits the amount of production or sale of a product. So we limit how much you can import in. So let's cut down on the total number of strawberries imported. So import quotas effectively rise prices, lower imports, and increase domestic production. Tariffs is really a tax. It's a tax levied on imports. So effectively, it drives up the price of those imports. So tariffs raise the price, lower imports, increase domestic production, and raise tax revenue. Canada, for example, has tariffs on certain types of footwear. And again, to protect local industry. You're going to pay more for your shoes, though. Currency exchange controls are government restrictions limiting the amount of foreign currencies that can be obtained. So if you can't buy Canadian dollars or get Canadian dollars in order to buy stuff or sell stuff, it makes it very difficult to do trade. Bureaucratic restrictions are basically rules. We don't allow you to sell those types of cars here because they don't meet the safety requirements or the emission requirements. So the rules that make it hard for foreign producers to enter in a country and to require the products to be modified really before entering, which drives up the cost, makes them less attractive locally. And voluntary export restrictions are really an agreement by exporting country to restrict the amount of its exports to another country. So effectively, we put political pressure on them and say, hey, you're bringing in too many cars. And they say, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll limit the amount of cars we send to your country. So trade restrictions by any way you slice it drive up prices. Less Canadian consumption, more tax revenue collected in terms of that consumption, and higher prices. Next, we're going to identify the various restrictions to and some of the arguments against free trade. Well, there's lots of arguments against free trade. And the key one tends to be strategic. And the strategic argument is basically we need to protect our country's industries to make sure that they're there when we need them. And that was the case during the pandemic. We couldn't get vaccines. They're made somewhere else in the world, and we were in line waiting for our share. And a lot of people said, no, we need to be able to make vaccines here in Canada. So the strategic argument says, let's not trade those things. Let's build them right here. Even though there may not be a big market here or may not be financially feasible, it is a surety that we have them when we need them. The next basic argument is the infant industry argument, where we have a brand new industry, such as the electric car business. Canada just enticed Volkswagen to set up a plant in St. Thomas, Ontario to make car batteries. Well, the argument is that even though they might be able to make those car batteries somewhere else more cheaply, it's worth our while to get this industry started because electric cars are the future and we need to build a base for the industry, and hence We need to compete in that industry and incentivize companies to come and set up here to build it made right here. Next, there's the cultural identity argument, and that is, look, if we can protect our own culture and our own industry, that will have a multiplier effect for domestic production. More movies, more music, more art being produced in Canada, and we're not overwhelmed by the United States. And this has really been the CanCon regulations that we have, Canadian content regulations on radio, means that a certain number of Canadian songs need to be played every hour. And that has to do with the cultural identity argument. The uncontrolled movement of capital and labor argument. If we don't have borders in the sense that anyone can work anywhere, what's the point of it? So, it erases the need for a border. We become the 51st state of the United States if people can move money, move ideas, move people so easily that, we're just the same as them. And then we got the environmental and labor standards. Environmental standards in Canada are pretty high. We kind of look to them and say, this is something we value. Reduced emissions, for example, low carbon. This is something that we uphold. So that costs a lot of money. It drives up the cost of doing business here, but it's worthwhile. It will be eroded if we say, look, you can get oil from anywhere cheaply, made in countries that don't care about human rights, don't care about the environment. We could get much cheaper oil, but that's not worth it. And same thing with labor standards. If human rights are neglected somewhere else in the world and you can make that product more cheaply, like China, but that's riding on our shoulders when those people work for very little pay and have very little protection. And we got people here that think that's wrong. We should be buying stuff from those countries that don't have any standards. We should be made right here, doing it right here, good union jobs. We hear this constantly hammered out in the media. So those are key things that you want to look at in that unit. If you have any questions, please let me know.